Looking through this month's issue of BRM, I spotted that Ebridge Mill has a rather nice little canal basin. Now, I'm familiar with canal basins. There's several around me and I'm not very far away from Birmingham, which famously has more canals than Venice. So I thought for this month's project it'd be rather nice to build a boat. Now, canals have changed a lot. For the modern day, it's really a leisure place. So I thought it'd be great to build a little leisure boat, a small cabin cruiser, and to do that I'm actually using a very traditional kit, Craftline Models balsa wood kit. Now, I started my model making with a big bag of balsa wood, so it's a material I'm fairly familiar with, but I'll be honest, I suspect most people simply don't use it that often. Anyway, let's have a look at the kit. The first thing is you get some printed sides and ends for your boat, a set of instructions, and most importantly, some bits of balsa. Now, the two main parts, the cabin is shaped for you. The hull, well, that's not very hull shaped, but at least there's a slot in it, which we'll use in a minute. And they take the tiller to the top, so we'll put that aside for later. The most exciting bit is the pile of balsa wood parts. Now, we don't use all of these for this kit, but they are all printed onto a single sheet of balsa. So the first job actually is to start cutting things out. For this, all you're going to need is a sharp knife, and it is important to use a sharp knife for this balsa because it will tend to split along the grain. This isn't the end of the world if this happens, because you can always glue the parts back together, but the sharper the knife, the less split and less damage that you'll find. So, following the instructions, which I have read in advance, I haven't just unpacked this kit, I need to cut out part A, and part A is clearly marked. And don't go through the balsa in one go, go through several times. Again, you can hear it splitting there, but there you are, that's cut out. And then slowly cut around the edges. And I'll just finish this and then we'll move on to the next step. The great thing about the sharp knife is you really can feel it slicing through the balsa wood, which is very, very soft indeed. Although pedants will explain that technically this is actually a hardwood. For our purposes, it's flipping soft. Keep your fingers away from it, it's really easy to go mad. And then there's some little part to cut out at the end. And we have to cut out fiddly work here. We actually have to cut out the centre of this part. Now this is where the wood really can split, because you've got very little meat there to hold the part together. I say don't worry, because this is going to stick onto another block of wood, and you can always stick the two parts, if you broke it in half, onto the piece of wood. You can guess how I know that one. Okay, there we have it. Actually, mine has split. Balsa wood does come in various qualities, and so it's probably not your fault. It could just be that the wood actually isn't very strong. So there we are. I now have one part that should actually be, one part that has come up in three pieces. Never mind. The correct glue for balsa is, amazingly, balsa cement, which smells slightly. So don't use this in a particularly small room, but it's a great fast-acting cement. I've put a bit much on the wood there, but it doesn't matter. It dries very, very quickly and is also useful for card kits. If you're, you can see I'm just reassembling the jigsaw here. If you're building a card kit, it will actually glue the card kit together as well. But there we are, right. And that's the first part now. What you can see is this is actually the bow of the boat, the bow being the front part, nautical term there, stern being the back end of it. You've got the bow of the boat here, and once this is dried, what I'll do is I will have to shape the block of balsa to fit around it. So, if I hang on for a minute, we'll let that dry, and then we'll move on to the next step. Okay, while I've been letting the glue dry, I've cut out the other two parts I shall need for this boat. So quite a lot of these parts relate to a different kit. That's why most of them aren't used. Anyway, the glue has dried. That's now nice and firmly on the top there. and I need to shape the bow. Now the great thing about this kit is you don't need very many tools. A knife, a small saw and a couple of sanding sticks are all that is required for this. So I'm just going to roughly hack the front end off the boat. Now you could do this, if I'm honest, with a knife. It's just a bit quicker and easier and slightly safer with a saw. But again, you can see how soft this wood is. And then I'm going to take a fairly coarse sanding stick, a bit of emery paper, some sandpaper, anything will do this job, and just give the front of the boat a quick shape. It's worth looking at some photos of canal boats when you do this, because they're not completely flat. You actually need to put a bit of chamfer around the bottom of the hull as well. I'm not going to worry too much about getting this perfect at this stage, because there's a little bit more sanding to do, and I'll come to that in a moment. But there we have it. We've got the rough shape of the boat there. Now there is a bit more. You're probably wondering what the slot is there. There is a piece to go in there as well to form the very tip of the bow. There's one more job to do once I've shaped the bow, and that is to chamfer this top part so that there's a slight rise to the next part that goes on top of it. Again, a few seconds with the sanding stick. A bit of dust, and there we are. Ready for the next part, so I can finish building up the bow. In effort to use less glue, hold the tube, and this works with plastic glue as well, hold the tube horizontal and hold the part near it. It doesn't all come out all over the place. And there we have it, the two parts there. Just push them down slightly, and there we go. Next job is to fit the cabin, which is, as you can see, quite a large lump, slightly shaped, a bit more balsa glue on the bottom there, and stick that into place. Followed by the stern of the boat, stern being the back end of the boat, another nautical term there. Fits in behind the cabin. Now you see the glue's not completely rock solid yet, so I've got a bit of wiggle room, but pretty quickly I've built up the basic boat shape. Now I'm going to have to shape the stern in the same way that I've shaped the bow, but there's a little bit more work to do, and then I will then sand this bottom bit for the hull is very slightly too wide as well, so I'll sand that back. Here's one I did earlier. As you can see, I've stuck all the bits of balsa into place now. The bow is now finished, as is the stern, and the cabin's been fitted on with a couple of hatches on top. The next stage is to paint the boat, but if I just stick paint straight onto this, balsa will swell, the grain will be raised, and it'll go all furry and horrible. That's not going to look very pretty, because these things should be nice and smooth. So what I need to do is I need to seal the wood surface, and to do that I'm going to use a product that older modelers may well be familiar with, but I suspect most modern modelers never come into contact with, and that is something called sanding sealer. Sanding sealer is a sort of cellulose dope with a filler in. I think it's often talcum powder effectively, and what this does, you paint it on and it smells, so don't do this in the confined spaces. Our camera crew are already getting slightly wobbly, but paint it on and it soaks into the wood and it will seal the surface. You'll need to wash the brush out. I tend to use an old brush on this, but you'll need to wash the brush out with cellulose thinners as well when you're working on it. But this stuff dries incredibly quickly, and you get to the stage where the wood is nicely sealed. And the idea is that I'll paint the entire boat, seal the boat, and then once it's dry, I'll sand the surface. And so once it's dry, I can actually sand it to a pretty mirror-like finish if I'm willing to put the effort in. To be honest, what I tend to do is just give it a light work over with a fairly smooth sanding stick, give it a second coat, and again, polish it up so it's ready for paint. You'll actually be able to feel the surface being really, really smooth. It's difficult to describe, but it's quite incredible when you actually use it. Sanding sealer is cheap enough, and it's actually very useful if you're doing any wooden modelling. Seal the surface and it will take paint an awful lot better. So the next stage is to paint your model. Now I've just used perfectly ordinary Humbrol enamels on this, a couple of coats, and you can see I've given the hull a nice coat of black. Canal boats are traditionally black down there, and then some brighter colours for the top, because a lot of the decoration is actually done for you on the decoration sheet. And so all I have to do is cut out the various bits of decoration and stick them on the side of the boat. Let's start with one of the sides. Again, sharp knife, steel rule, keep your fingers back and quickly whip that out. And there's two sides and 3 ends, because you can have some alternative front panels for the boat, so you can have a bit of variety with your between your models if you build more than one. So there we are. These aren't stickers, they are just printed paper, and it's important to do a little dry run with them before you fit them on. You notice I've painted the ends red, because I know from previous experience that this bit of paper isn't quite long enough and there's just a little gap at the corners. And this is something you'll often find people mention with card kits, is that the edges will be exposed. Find the nearest match you can and just run along the edges with an appropriate colour. Doesn't have to be a perfect match. It's really a case of just hiding the white edges. And I say this is quite important if you're doing any card kit buildings. Again, hide the white edges, because that really shows up to the eye. Whereas if it's something near the right colour, your eye will tend to ignore it. And I can now stick this onto the side of the boat. Sticking the sanding sealer, the balsa glue might do it, but to be honest, it's probably just as easy to use a general all-purpose glue. And just work a little bit of that on there. Smear it around with your finger. Do try not then to touch the printed paper with the finger you've been smearing glue with. And there we go. Decoration, and it's nice and quick, nice and simple. And there we have a nice quick decorated boat side. What I'll do is I'll work my way around the other sides, leaving only one job, and that is almost the most exciting bit, and that is to put the tiller in place. For that, a little brass pre-formed tiller is provided, which should fit about there. You can just push it in, but I prefer just to give it a poke with a sharp bradawl and poke it in that way. Handy canal hint: when boats are parked at the side of the river, the tiller is usually pushed over to one side, partly because that's how they've steered, but also because it makes it a lot easier to get in and out. So there are a little bit more finishing, and I can show you one I finished earlier. Ready for my little canal basin scene, and there we have it. One simple, cheap and very attractive and colourful addition to your layout.